Okay, so today on Friday, we will go into generalities of sustainability. So same as last week, we'll try to give all the general concepts before we go into the lectures of the specific materials. Let me put the subtitles. Okay. Okay. Actually, subtitles are useful, but either you listen or you read. It's hard to do both. And real-time subtitles have many misses. So just be careful with it. So today we will have like a general context of sustainability. The question with sustainability is that it was totally new subject like 20 years ago. And now everybody is expert with many different opinions and different views. So things become very confusing, either oversimplified or over-mystified. Since we don't have a proper teaching of sustainability at the school, I think it's good at the beginning to have at least some basic notions to have the wider context of it. So today we will do generalities, and Friday we will see most issues of sustainability related to materials. This is how the lecture is organized. This is like a Scottish Highlands Glencoe Valley with a primitive huts, which looks like a paradise, a natural environment, but according to the locals, it's also kind of an ecological and sustainability disaster. So we'll have an introduction about what is sustainability and the basic concepts. Let's okay. It's out. Then we went to specific areas as social, cultural issues, site issues, energy issues, and design issues. Finally, material issues will be on Friday. It's like dividing in 5 subjects, 5 fields, which give quite a general view of it. So let's start with it. If I ask anybody in class about environment, probably we most share concerns about pollution, about climate change in whichever way it happens, about energy problems. These are things that have better or worse areas, but still kind of concern, right? So probably we would agree there's many things which are wrong, look wrong. But probably if we ask what can we do, and most questions will be somebody has to do something, right? It's like politicians, policymakers, big companies, but actually it is like everybody's problem. It's not anymore problem of experts, problem of big companies or policymakers. Of course, it is about everybody, but it starts with everybody. So better we are aware and we are able to make our choices with good information, which is very difficult because there's a lot of misinformation and it's very hard to get a proper guide. So what is sustainable architecture? If we look for names, and the words are important because words just give labels to things we have in our thought, right? It's how we see reality. There's many words for that. In the 1960s, we spoke a lot about bioclimatic architecture and ecologic architecture. Actually, ecologists is also a political movement. Green architecture has been for a long time on and still is very used. Then we have sustainable architecture, which is the title we are using here. But we recently hear about zero energy architecture, which is a big issue because we have to comply with it. And going further, zero carbon architecture because we're going to neutrality. So why so many words, right? And what's the difference between them? So before we went to it, I have the first question for you, so you can go to your activity sheet and discuss with your classmate which, if all those terms are the same, or if there's some term which is more appropriate or more interesting than others, or if there is any other term that you think is missing there. So just to spend some minutes discussing and telling or deciding. You can speak now, it's not a quiz, right? The activities are just to keep you awake and also to introduce you to make your mind on thinking mode, not just on passive mode of hearing. So we have 6 terms, maybe more, maybe they're the same, not the same, right? So just very briefly, I can hear opinions. Okay, we don't have much time, so just write briefly whatever you decided or you thought. So I didn't comment. We don't have much time in class to add more comments and so on. So last week activities and this week, I will comment on your replies and the questions. And I will upload that on Blackboard so you can look into it later. So last week maybe will be available tomorrow or so on. Okay. Individually, I comment almost everybody, but for general comments, instead of doing it in class, and exceptionally we'll do it, you will have them available in Blackboard. So please add your comment and let's continue, because as usually today is a very busy class and we don't want to go too fast. Okay, surely next time I will give you my opinion about this, but I want to hear yours. Let's continue. If we see how much terminologies are used in publications about green architecture, bioclimatic, ecological, and sustainable architecture, we can see that until 1980, right, or 1990 actually, there was not many publications. But in the year 2000, they kind of increased. We're speaking of 20 years, right, of speaking about it. And for some reason, sustainable is becoming the most prevalent word used, whilst green architecture is one. Then bioclimatic and ecological is getting less and less used. It's just a trend. Just the statistics. This is the Google Ngrams. So they just make statistics of how often one word appears in published works. So there have been many tries to make a definition. The first one that I know we have in 1987, like 35 years ago. It was the United Nations, and it was like a general term of sustainability. And its beautiful definition, sustainability meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. Beautiful definition, hardly useful, because we hardly know what we need. Yeah, we have many false needs. It's impossible we guess the needs of future generations. Just think back, think of your grandparents. They would never even imagine we have needs for electricity to have our mobile devices charged more than water or food, right? So what will happen in 20, 30, 100 years, we have no idea. So reasonable and beautiful as it is hard to put in use. But I want to call the attention about the keyword, which is need. Yeah. And this is something which will appear often in the lectures and the comments. And I think it's keyword for not only sustainability, but for architecture in general. 5 years later, the International Institute of, or the American Institute of Architects tried to apply that to architecture, and they changed the term. They said ecological design, right? Not sustainable. This is why I think it's important to see why we change the words and be aware of that. So it's the careful meshing of the human purposes with the larger patterns and flows of the natural world, which is interesting. It's just living in harmony with nature, which means knowing how nature works and then try to insert our activity there without interrupting that kind of flow. It's kind of oxymoron because architecture and city are by nature destructive, right? It's like controlling nature. But again, interesting definition. And this is what we have. This is the two official definitions. So what can we do? Because with that, there's not much we can do in our design. So since we need to work, and the architecture, design, construction has a lot of responsibility and a lot of impact in environment and sustainability, we have to devise practical ways to be sustainable. And this is what we call strategies. We don't have a general theory, but we have many things which we know that work. You don't need to read everything, but we don't have any general theory or method. We have theories, plenty of them, to calculate the structures, to calculate air conditioned. We have it. But general sustainability at large is very tough. We don't have, right? But we have the small things that work. So that's what we call the specific strategies. While science and research advance, we have to work every day. So we apply what we know. And we call strategies, right? And the strategies try to be as wide as possible because there's many areas we can work which have an impact. So it is just beyond bioclimatic or just beyond energy saving. It's trying to go to that initial definition of the AIA to consider as much as we can the general frame of the nature and human activity, which is quite ambitious. That's a practical way of dealing with it. So that's the reason of it. And what we do is, in general, to approach areas we know. I myself summarized in 5 families of strategies. I try to make things simple. So 5 is already one number, which is still the memory is not very stressed. Of course, it's not original. There are very good publications which inspired this, which speak of 10, 20, 50 different strategies. This is just trying to be practical for our classroom and for our everyday activity. And today we will see the first 4 ones. So social and cultural issues. And I start with this because it's very often ignored and not considered as part of sustainability. But I think the starting point. Let's start with this. This is Sadong. This is sales. I think we all like sales. But you know, this is the paradox, right, of saving, right? What is the paradox? And that sales period is very clear about it. Everything is 50% cheaper, but we end up buying things we don't need. So in the end, we spend a lot of money we don't need to spend. That is the trap of the sales. And that happens in all aspects of life. That's a kind of human basic activity. An economist studied it, right? So I give you an example. LED lighting saves a lot of energy. Maybe it's like a 10% or less than conventional light. So everybody changed to LED, and because it doesn't spend so much energy, they are all day long switched on. You have LED everywhere. So in the end, we are spending more energy than with the old light bulbs that we have to diligently turn off when we don't use them. But if you make the calculation, most places they end spending more just because of this kind of sales vision. And this is a problem of consumption society, right? Sobi Sahoe, of which we are part. To make a contrast, let's go to one of the poorest. Well, it is changing, but still one of the poorest countries. But this was like 15 years ago. Cuba. Very poor, but high in the ranks of happiness in the world, which is also an interesting thing to consider. So let's assume this is a pillow shop, pillow, right? It is not, but let's think it is it. If somebody in Cuba needs a pillow, they will try by all means to see if that's really necessary to buy. They will try to use an old one, mend, get from somebody who doesn't use. When they are totally convinced it is not possible, they have to buy, they go to the shop, they buy the pillow, they go home, right? It's the anti-consumption society, but it is very sustainable attitude. Right? Actually, poor countries, and we can speak of Cuba, but you know the recent Pritzker Prize awardees, Lacaton and Vassal, both had experience living in Africa, poor countries, and what they said, they learned this kind of very practical approach to life, which is very sustainable. It's really very aware of the needs. And you see, need is a key word we have to consider. That is reasonable, that is sustainable. So we have to start asking the right questions. Well, which is the real need? And actually, this is how we start one project. What we need, we make the program and we start designing. And the one question is, do we need a new building or a new city? Of course, if you're an architect, some client comes to you, you will not tell him, you don't need a new building because you lose your job, right? But that's what Lacaton and Vassal were famous for, right? They had a commission to renew one square. They went there and said, it's not necessary, this is perfect. Let's just use this money for something else. Right? That was reasonable. So need, keyword. I give you one example. It's kind of a bit old, but Dongdaemun Station, line 2 and line 3 station, Dongdaemun Undongjan, changed to Dongdaemun Yoksamunha Gongwon. Yep, right, longest station name. Just because of the DDP was in construction, and they wanted to make the whole environment consistent with DDP. So the station should show kind of designed, cool, modern world. And that's kind of old-fashioned 1980s design. So they did change. This is during the construction. They did a change to make a trendy image. Instead of the tile, they put those boards we know, which, okay, it's trendy, and somebody was working about it. So it is moving the economy of the city. It was positive. But actually, there was no need. The tiles were really excellent quality. One thing that Solsoboy has is very good quality materials. And those tiles, after 20 years, were perfect, or almost 30 years. And they would be perfect for another 30 years without problem. The boards, the sheets, the metal sheets are already scratched, bumped, and old. So they will not last so long. So the quality is worse. Besides, the station is very busy. Those few centimeters make the space for circulation narrower. So the space is not great. So there was a change, but not improving. So there's actually no need, apart from the intention to make things just look better. But it was just okay. Subway station is a subway station. More extreme are cities. This is probably one of the most famous examples. Some developer thought that the capital of California would move to the desert. So he bought a huge land to make a 3 million people capital in the Mojave Desert City. Now about 20,000 people live there. But you can see all the energy, pollution, and destruction that this creates just because of the bet of a businessman. Right? So this is no need. This is one big failure, just a huge impact. And this is something which is famous and extreme, but we see it everywhere. We have many cities in China. Some of them were successful, but many of them have become famous because they're ghost cities. People do not live there because they already have the city. It's lively, and so on. And even in Spain, this is my hometown, Madrid. To make it the context, this area is more or less the medieval city until the 19th century. This area is like the 20th century industrial city. The new towns we're speaking is about this. So you can see the size of the new towns around there. And we have all around. If we see the detail of that, it is cities, it is streets completely finished with asphalt, lighting, services, nobody building because there was no really need. The city could not expand so fast. So these are very clear examples of unnecessary work based just on too much hot dreams of developers and businessmen and politicians, right? Without a clear vision of what is the real need. Second point, how much technology can people manage? We think of sustainable buildings as high technology. We rely on engineers, and we make buildings so complicated that hardly anybody can use them. So if there's not a culture for using the technology, technology is totally useless, right? You're very young, so probably you didn't know or you don't remember the beginning of the mobile phones, right? Mobile phones were really complicated to use, right? Until smartphones appeared, and then everybody used them, and this part of the culture. Right? We don't have yet the kind of smartphone of sustainable architecture. High technology, sustainable buildings are a nightmare. It's kind of summarized in this kind of 1960s movie, which have such a complicated building that it is the Cartman, yeah, the Kwan Lisa. People without education, without training, has to deal with very complex machines, and they go wrong all the time. And actually, if you see the statistics, a huge percentage of the failures of high technology sustainable buildings are because nobody knows how to use them. Right? So you have to make things simple, thinking on the user, not thinking on the emotion of the engineer making the perfect machine. Because we design for everyday people, not for experts, not for computer nerds. And then, speaking of the social issues, and world is kind of globalized, but urban culture is very different everywhere. Even within Korea, which has the reputation of being a very compact and homogeneous country, Gangwon-do, Gyeongsang-do, Jeju-do have very different ways of dealing with the way of life, and even Hanoks have slight differences which demonstrate different way of living, right? So you have to be aware of that. Sometimes we assume everybody is the same, and it's not. The cultural variety is important. It's something which is not necessary to erase. Right? If we compare those two maps, right, on the left, Beijing, China. On the right, Seoul. They are drawn mostly in the same period, beginning of 20th century. Both cities have been designed with the same theory. The handbook is the same. Actually, Korea is imitating the Chinese culture, right? To make the palaces, the distribution, the orientation, and so on. But why are they so different? See, Beijing, the city has big nature, and you can even see like its natural elements which are embodied or embedded in that element. But the city is referencing, right? The geometry is the reference itself. In Korea, until Japanese took over and did some more scientific cartography, all maps are a collection of mountains, streams, natural features, which are the references, and the city wall just adapts to it. That demonstrates a very different way to approach nature. In the case of Chinese empire, arrogant, powerful, conquering nature. In the case of a small but beautiful Korea, dealing with nature, keeping it and integrating into it. And I think still some of that remains. That's a demonstration of this, or a manifestation of this different temper, this different sensibility on dealing with the same urban problem. And if we go to difficult areas, the following is a real photo of Hahue Maul in Andong, in which the topography is so complicated that there's no way to make this kind of ideal geometry, but still they gently react to the course of the river, right? So the city organically finds a way to deal with this kind of very unique geographical setting. I think it's kind of unique Korea. I think it's beautiful. It's great. So with this tradition, what do we do? Well, this is Banpo, right? Abstract geometry, production, business, nothing else. And you can say, well, this is after the war, this is reconstruction. Now we do better because now we are cultural leaders in the world. So this is what we do now. A bit better, some kind of landscape, but abstract landscape, kind of ready-made, which is the same for Seoul, or same for Gangwon-do, or the same for Jeju-do. Maybe Jeju, they have more palm trees, but you can see everywhere the same, as you have the same McDonald's in Seoul or in Honolulu, right? And we can go to extremes. Can you guess what is this? This is obviously familiar. This is very much a standard Korean big company design, right? Well, this is Vietnam. And this kind of construction in Vietnam climates is a nightmare, right? But Vietnamese are so happy because they have the image of advanced country as Korea is. So it's kind of longing for this kind of belonging to the first world, but people will be unable to live there unless spending a huge lot of energy, and even so being uncomfortable, right? If you're behind a glass wall with sunshine and hot climate, even with air condition, you're uncomfortable. But you're uncomfortable in the bus seat under the sunshine, no matter how much cool air you have. So globalization, universality is great, but still, I think we should pay more attention to individual local characteristics because we can make much better, right? Those buildings may be in ruins very soon because they will need a huge lot of maintenance also. So this is the summary of the first part. Very summarized, but I think quite useful checklist in design and planning. Second, about site, more specific, like the global ecology and local ecology. It's a bit longer, but easy to understand. So first, as we said, construction is destruction of nature. And the first way that happens when we build cities is to destroy both animal and plants, right? And again, we lose farmland, which is a huge problem. If you see all new towns around Seoul have been based on rice fields and agricultural areas. And this is increasing the people who need to eat every day, but we are reducing the possibility to create food. And we are approaching a global food crisis. And this photo in the Museum of Seoul History is great because it demonstrates this kind of very aggressive attitude to wipe out agriculture to make a new modern industrial city, which is great, but still, no matter how modern, cities need to eat. And we're destroying this kind of very fertile, very profitable soil. Then cities disrupt all those natural flows. What we are speaking, the IAIA, to meshing in the flows of nature, disrupt them. And if we go to the tradition, this is a famous diagram, the Feng Shui or Pungsu here in Korea. in which it's not only trying to find an harmony with a propitious site in mountains and water, it's about having this kind of balance, right? So now scholars agree that this has some sense in terms of climate control and the adaptation to the site without destroying the nature. If you see the photo of Yandong village, which is one of the few remaining traditional villages, I just take a quotation of a kind of recent book in which scholars agree that beyond that kind of ancestral culture, there is actually a real sustainable living, right? Those towns have been designed to keep in touch, to just balance the activity. So they make use of the seasons, the nature as it is without making a huge destruction. And something which has for many years remained as kind of small museum, remains of the past. Now it is studied with more interest. It's kind of guide, a possibility to incorporate, to include in our planning, in our design vision. We go back to Vitruvius, right? And I think Romans are interesting because they spent centuries creating new cities from Germany and Scotland to Egypt. So they work in all climates. So they have a huge experience. And what they say is quite reasonable. So Vitruvius said, well, you have to look first for a high place to have clean air, to avoid humidity, which is interesting. You have to identify healthy places. And it was interesting. They would sacrifice animals and watch their liver. If the liver was healthy, they would think there was the water and the vegetables that were okay. So they would think it's a proper place for living, right? And finally, the position for each given location. So they were aware that each site is different. You know, they would have first the military settlement, and they would like 10, 20, 30, 50 years until that the city will expand. So they have time to understand the climate and to make adjustments and to then make the city. And this is why Roman cities were so successful. Still, we use them because they were in the right place with the right shape. So they work. So you have to see how the sea, mountains, sunlight, winds, and so on affect it. This is kind of common sense, but modern planning mostly ignores most of them because we can correct any of them, right? But this is kind of a acting in which you take advantage of the nature of the site. You don't correct the nature. Correcting the nature means destroying it through technology to make it suitable to us. And today, there's a trend to look back at it, to rely less on technology and to be more aware of those things. As an example, I just reproduced one page of the AIA standards. They have pages and pages try to convince you that you can use to your advantage natural winds, natural light, sunlight, and so on to make better design, not just making the proper air-conditioned calculation, right? Which is interesting. However, still, especially since the Second World War, when we have the fluorescent lighting, air-conditioned, right, and cars, still the idea that we just create a climate with technology, right, independently of whatever place we are, is very strong. This is one example of Tokyo. In the 1990s, Japan developed a technology to create high-rise earthquake-proof. That was not possible before. But if you can create high-rise, the only place they had was the reclaimed land in Tokyo Bay. And they did 50, 60, 70 floors, apartments like crazy. It was great. But they didn't preview. This barrier of high-rise buildings just block the breezes from the sea. So after that, the summer temperature in Tokyo rose considerably. And the climate of Tokyo, which was already miserable in summer, became much more miserable. And this is Japan. In Seoul, we have Hangan. So we do this next to Hangan to avoid this kind of flow from the mountains to the river, right? Which also cools Seoul, not as much as it should, because we're making more and more high rise. So that kind of airflow is more and more difficult. And that creates more reliance on air conditioned. This is a Pyeonghwasijang before the renovations. It's like thousands, millions of air-conditioned machines just heating the environment to make the inside usable, at least inhabitable. And this creates this falling from the heat island effect, which creates even up to 6 degrees warmer areas because we're coming then, right? And that creates kind of a vicious circle in which you need more cooling, and that heats even more. And that also increases the ozone pollution. So it's very nasty effect, which we still have a long way to correct or to solve. The photo is London, which you can see the huge difference between the center and the sides, right? Seoul, you can make the experience. As soon as you go out of Seoul, near Achasan or near Inwonsan, the temperature becomes so much cooler. And of course, we have all the erosion sediments. We don't need to remember because very recently that happened. If you see the view of Seoul, Seoul is a huge valley between mountains, right? Hangan is a monumental river. And this area used to be rice fields, which are always flooded with water. This is why we have rice, right? But not full of buildings. So a natural sponge which absorbed water and regulated the flow from the storms is now going instantly to Hangan. This is why it rises so fast. This is a section of an average small office tower. Because of the ground is so expensive, the basements are huge, but Hangan or Gangnam is riverside. So you have phreatic is groundwater, underground water. Most basements are underwater, right? So I have a question for you. This is the second question, and we have only 1 minute because we have to finish soon and we are halfway the lecture and I want to rush. So how do you think the groundwater is managed? We have thousands of office buildings, right? We have those towers with a lot of basements with the groundwater above the basement. So how do we deal with this water? Right. What do we do with it? We have to build, we have to excavate, right? It's kind of really underwater construction. But even after we excavate, the water exists because it's flowing from the mountains down. So what happens with that water? What do we do? 1 minute, think about it. You can discuss and give me your hint. I will comment on Friday. Actually, it's not only Gangnam. This building, this basement is also underwater. We are in the hill, but there's groundwater here. So water level is over this floor. I have seen this construction, and I can tell you, we are under the water now. Okay, I'm looking forward to see your replies. Just say something, don't leave it blank. Make a guess. Well, the point is we have a huge surface of buildings with basements right over there, and this is all blocking the water. So there's no wonder we have those flooding from time to time. Right. Then very easy to understand, we have pollution in all orders, not only air and water. So, and air pollution is nastier than we think. If we see the UN statistics of deaths by bad air, Korea is champion. Spain appears quite okay, but my hometown, Madrid, is not so healthy either. And the water is even worse. If we see the pollution of water, the beautiful Mediterranean, which is my sea, is almost Dead Sea in near time, but we have almost all huge urban areas, cities are almost in ecological death or extremely dirty. We have light pollution, which recently we know it's kind of disrupting the movement of birds and insects. And this is mostly a problem of town planning and the use of artificial lighting at night. And we have sound pollution, which is kind of recent problem, but cities are noisy, consumption are noisy, and more we have statistics of sicknesses, of issues related to that pollution. And finally, adequacy of site. This is more interesting because here we can make sure we build cities and buildings where it's proper to it, right? You have to know the topography, the climate, the geology. This is what Vitruvius was saying, actually. And of course, communication, infrastructure, and so on. All that should be considered when making a city. And again, we are so confident with our technology that it is mostly economic and political factors which decide where we will build cities and buildings. And then we have this. This is Guatemala. It's a huge cavity created on the ground. This is very extreme, but happens very often in many cities where you have this kind of ground. And this is just not having a proper maintenance of the sewage system, but also because not being in a proper ground for a city. And we said the land good for agriculture is bad for construction. So when we create those new towns, we just destroy a very fertile, rich ground, which is very hard to recover later. The flood zones, it's very hard to see. 100 years means, statistically, we may think that the worst flood in 100 years may be next year, right? So we have to know how big is it. 100 years is a kind of American standard. I don't know about Korea. In Spain, we have to see 1,000 years. So I have no idea how we can guarantee that. That's what the law says. And of course, we can always restore and enhance. So we can make our planning, our renovations, our projects in a way that we try to make back or to recover some of the things which were lost. So that summarizes the site issues. Next is energy, which may be the best known, so we don't need to give so much detail because for many people, sustainability is just energy savings. And we have like a few issues. We know resources are limited. We know that creates pollution. We know that we are dependent on energy. Energy is getting more expensive, and the design process is not great to have a very efficient design in terms of energy. I would stress this image, which is interesting. This was probably 10 years ago. It's first a great exercise in graphic expression of very complicated terms, but it's telling us that huge amount of the energy we consume now in the world is not renewable still, right? But even worse, this ending point here is not very clear in the slide, but it's telling that near 55% of the energy we produce worldwide is lost on the way, which is quite embarrassing considering how proud we are of our technology. There is to solve it, but it's not easy. So if we were able to work only on these losses, which appear all the way during the creation, distribution, and use, if we solve that, a huge amount of energy would be recovered, right? But this is just going into heat, which you know is not good because adding heat to the environment is not what we need right now. So quite interesting thing there. Second thing is that in most policies, 2030, which is just 7-8 years away, is like the deadline for zero energy. And we are not doing very well on that, right? That includes Korea also. We're not ready. And so I give you just a very fast summary on what we do to have a reasonable use of energy. First, we maximize as much as we can passive systems, natural ventilation, natural light, natural wind, shading, and so on, depending on the climate. That's what we call the passive design. And this is a design issue. This is what you do in the beginning, from choosing the site to detailing the facades, the openings, the interior distribution, and so on. Once you do that, so with insulation, thermal mass, we will speak about that later. Natural light, natural shading, sunlight, et cetera, right? Then, since passive design reduces your needs, you can make active systems much smaller, sometimes just 1/5 or 1/10 of the size, which is great because in that case, you can use more efficient elements. Since you need less, you can buy more expensive, more efficient machines. And finally, this is just the last point, which often is the only point that doesn't make sense. When you did everything possible, then you can consider to add renewable energies on site, because then the need of energy is very small. So you will need a reasonable amount of solar panels or whatever you want to use, right? So this is the reasonable process on how we do this kind of energy efficient design. And I stress, we start from design intentions, right? Here, the role of the architect and of course the client is extremely important. And very important in any field of design, we have great simulation tools, great computers, but reality is reality. Design is just a bet on the future. There's many things we don't know. Simulations are always ideal. Do not take into account construction errors, efficiency of the real machines, the real use of the building. The example of a London City Hall, which is quite old, but can apply to any modern project. Norman Foster, who is a great architect, won all the prizes. It was perfect. It had all the features to be a perfect sustainable design, and it was copied, published everywhere. The surprise came later when they made a revision, and it scored worse than Everyday's building. Why is it? Right? It was a shock, right? Well, construction was not perfect. You had to fine tune afterwards. Many of the provisions were too idealistic. As we said before, the building was very complicated, and the city hall has limited resources, so they were not using it properly. So in the end, it was much worse. And it happens very often with very well-designed buildings. But the point is, no matter how perfect is our simulation, reality is reality, right? And nobody knows the future. And the most difficult to preview is the real climate. So we don't know the real weather, which will happen later. And we don't know even less the user attitude, how people use the buildings. So we are very bad on time. So let's go over question 3. Don't do it. Just you can think about it at home. But I wish you to think about the second question, right? If you do something to improve the efficiency of a building, which costs money, do you think that money you spent, that cost, should be paid back by those savings? Or you should invest to make those savings, even though that will cost you money, it doesn't pay back, right? It's very, so if you spend 1 million to make this class more efficient, do we need to have 1 million in savings? Or maybe we can save only 500,000, but still it is worth doing that investment because the building is more efficient. Well, that's the question I made for you, but let's continue because we have not much time. So this is the issues of energy. Let's go the last 10 minutes into design, which is how we can implement those things in our so question number 3, we don't do in class because we have no time, right? We have those 2 minutes we spent trying to deal with the Zoom and so on. So we have to proceed. So we go back to Vitruvius because it is interesting. There's so much common sense there that I think it's interesting to go back to it. In his book 1, at the beginning, he speaks about the reasonable use of resources, right? And when he speaks of distributio, right use of materials and site is what I've been speaking about for almost 1 hour. Economic expenditure in the construction wisely directed. So that means spending only what is necessary. Again, it's being very aware of the needs and the possibilities. And Fermitas, which was the question today, right? To use a solid soil and to choose carefully the materials. You see, that's the beginning of the 10 books. And he's considering things we're telling now, which are important. Proper site, proper materials, be economical. Use only what you need, because more is just overspending. If we go to the graphic standards, I'm using 2008 edition, they try to make an updated diagram of those utilitas, firmitas, and venustas, right? And you see that in the end, even the most modern handbook goes to the classics, not because the technology was so advanced, it is because they have the common sense at some point we have lost. So the firmitas about ecology, they put, this is the modern vision, right? Construction, proper construction is more ecological, and this is more healthy and safe. In the end, the Vitruvius firmitas. And if we go to the three words, we don't need to rely only on quotations. You have to read the book. And I will go a bit deeper because it is interesting. Architecture is defined in three principles, but Vitruvius elaborates on that. And Firmitas goes into the what we call distributio, the reasonable use of the materials, proper materials in an economic way, what we need. But also decorum, honesty, which means making the design just adapted to the needs, to what you need in terms of function, but also in terms of symbolism, right? A temple will have some kind of expenditure which individual house will not have. This is what makes the Firmitas. And of course, he makes some comments on the beauty and the program, which will not comment. I leave just the basic keywords here. You may read the book if you find it interesting, but this is like a very great, compact definition of everything we need to consider in basic architectural design. So if we elaborate on that decorum, right? First, reasonable use of resources, right? Each part of the building, not speaking of the material, but each part, functional, decorative, symbolic, has a real function and meaning. So everything which is not necessary should be suppressed. This is a great design principle. If you don't need it, take it out. And decoration is still available, but must be related to construction, right? Then place selection. We will not insist because we already spoke about it, but interestingly, it is at the beginning of the treatise. And third, natural lighting and heating. And he elaborates on which is the ideal orientation for each room. And we come from Korea, in which south is everything and north is kind of hell. And I feel like too much simplification, right? So each orientation has its own characteristics. And for example, winter bedrooms, here comes to the west. So when you go to sleep, the room is most or less heated with sunshine. And offices and painting galleries must be north, because north is cold, but it's not dark. I always hear you telling, north is very dark. No, north is cool, which is great in summer. But a very nice diffuse light, which is great for offices, great for galleries. And if you see museums with natural light, mostly will get the light from the north, right? So please expand your mind. We are 5 minutes to the end. This is the exam question, so it has 2 points, right? South is great, but can be terrible. And in offices, south is a hell. Because you literally roast under sunshine even in winter. And Korean winter is very sunny. Okay, and then economia, we will finish with those things. So locally and with common sense. We commented already. You have to be aware of the materials available, the technologies, and the way of life they place. And second, according to the user. And this is great because the user in most modern design is just a kind of anecdote to make an abstract program. Most design is made for the sake of the glory of the architect. If you think otherwise, you can try to convince me. But think what you do at school and how much the user is the center of your design. But it was before. And then the context again, right? Each site must be well understood. Okay, we're insisting, what I said before, and these are things which We have plenty of articles, publications, papers published now telling those things, which are things which people knew for millennia, not centuries, right? We just kind of became crazy and thought, well, technology is everything. So I think interesting, beautiful thing. And if we go, this is kind of checklist I took again from the American standards, telling what you have to deal to be sustainable. If we just take a participatory design, a few things, everything in blue, right, was already considered in vitro use of the school. So most of the things we discover now were already discovered, right? So this is the summary. And then we have the numerical methods, which is very short thing. I'm introducing, this is practical tools we have to see how much sustainable we are in a certain way. But we are very in the end of the class, very near the end of the class. So I don't want to rush. Don't tell me we were too fast today. You can tell it. We'll end here. I will continue on Friday. So just to end, so it was not much left. Remember to fill the question 4. So if you have any question, please write it in the lower part of the sheet. And if you were late and didn't submit your assignment, you can submit it now. For the activity sheets, please collect them at the end of each row. So it is very easy to collect in order. So we don't spend so much time sorting them out. And that said, you're very welcome to write whatever you feel. And I will see you next Friday, this coming Friday. Yeah. Goodbye.
This submission.
Yes.
Thank you.
No, you have to. You have to. It's not I can. Thank you. Just bring it to the end of the row. Activities at the end of the row. And I will collect that together. Okay.
As I was the new registration student,
Oh,
so I
welcome.
didn't do the last time's assignment. Is that
You do it for next week. So
okay? Okay, thank you.
it's not very difficult. So it's just it might take a 30 minutes, 1 hour. So still, but better do it.
Thank you.